So let me begin by reiterating my gratitude to the Urban Studies Foundation for supporting this research. It has been really a great opportunity, and also thank you for inviting me to present this work in progress here to this excellent audience, and having such a special opportunity to present this work, well, quite in depth in a long format. It's really a privilege to be able to do that. Okay, so my topic is adaptive cities, and subtitle is Climate Change Adaptation in Dutch and Chinese Delta urban regions. So I should also stress that my mentors are Dominic Stedt, who's present here, and also Vincent Naden at TU Delft. And also you will notice that I put on the front page names of two research assistants, Yu Fang and He Jinghuan from South China University of Technology, who have been quite essential actually in making the Chinese part of this research possible. Right, so here's the outline of my talk. So I'll give you some background about why this topic is relevant first. Then I will present the conceptual framework and the research design. And subsequently, I will delve into the empirical part, covering first the Dutch case, looking into the climate adaptation in the Dutch cities in the Randstad region, and then looking into the case of the Pearl River Delta. And within that, I will have two subsections looking at Hong Kong and Guangzhou and Shenzhen, which are, well, as I will explain later, in quite different situations. I will finish with some findings that emerge from the fieldwork and conclusions for the research, and then with a little report on the progress in the projects, its outputs, and the next steps. Right, so a few words about the background to the study. So climate change is probably the biggest sort of challenge for, well, humanity in the coming decades. That sounds maybe a bit grand, but there's certainly a lot of truth to that. But at the same time, it's also a major challenge for the cities, and also the cities can play an important role in addressing this challenge. And that was kind of at the that was one of the sort of core ideas for starting this research and why I got interested in this topic. So basically, climate change is a problem that is both global and local, or glocal as some call it, because, well, it concerns the world as a whole, it affects the world as a whole, but at the same time its impacts are felt locally. And also what this means, this global and local nature, is that it calls for responses, for measures to tackle it, that concern multiple administrative levels. It is also a particularly complex problem that actually calls for integration of responses, calls for integrated policies to tackle it, because it concerns water management when it comes to raising sea level in particular and the increasing flood risk, but also spatial planning, housing policies, health policies, disaster management, and sort of emergency responses, but also research because of a number of uncertainties that are associated with this phenomenon. And how do cities fit into that? Well, it can be argued that they are both perpetrators of climate change, as it is in the cities that most of the emissions of greenhouse gases are being produced. But also they are their main victims because of the, well, large concentration of population in the cities. The negative effects of climate change are being felt particularly acutely in the cities. But also importantly, cities are part of the solution to this problem, because it is at the local scale that one can devise actually more manageable and concrete solutions, projects that can help mitigate emissions, but also adapt to the impacts that are already ongoing or are hardly reversible. So in this research, I focus in particular on delta urban regions. And the reason for that choice is because those kind of urban regions are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And this is to a number of reasons, which I'll try to cover here briefly. First, in urban deltas, one can observe a particular tension between the built and the natural environment. And also, well, the fact that urbanization in deltas tends to be intensive. That's where historically cities were set up and where, well, a lot of world's megacities today are located. And also there's a very close link between urbanization and vulnerability to climate change impacts. Rising sea levels is also particularly threatening for low-lying areas in deltas. Those kind of regions are also prone to river flooding because of the well, estuaries of the rivers with numerous streams and waterways. Also, they are quite prone to the effects of extreme weather events that, because of the high concentration of people and assets in urban deltas, they are, well, can be particularly harmful both for livelihoods and for economic activity. There's also, well, related to that, public health threats and stress on water resources that stem from the situation. Considering that, when you look, however, at the kinds of responses that were taken so far in the cities to tackle climate change, one can see that there's a number of obstacles and difficulties actually in adapting to climate change. And in the literature on this topic, which is currently rapidly growing, you see a number of points that come out in kinds of difficulties that are encountered, such as institutional blockages stemming, for example, from the clashes of interests between the departments of subnational authorities. So typically you would have a conflict between, for example, environmental protection and water resources departments versus spatial planning or urban development departments. Also, mismatch of priorities across the levels of government. So the national governments may have different priorities when it comes to tackling climate change than the cities have. Insufficient capacity and expertise at the local level in particular, or lack of funding for reaching national targets in climate policies or coming up with own solutions. Often it's also associated with lack of devolved authority to be actually able to take responsibility for the actions that would be required to tackle climate change. And finally, also what's been reported in the literature in terms of difficulties in governing climate change adaptations in cities is the question of coordination across municipal boundaries. So working on a kind of interjurisdictional level, for example, in metropolitan areas or in functional urban regions. Right, a few words about the conceptual framework for the study. So while most of the research in this field is grounded in, well, hydrology or study of actually the actual changes in the climate, or the analysis of spatial structures and how they affect vulnerability to climate change impacts. In this research, I use multi-level governance as a conceptual framework. And basically what it entails is recognizing the interdependencies across scales of government and also horizontally between the different jurisdictions. So multi-level governance, well, it's a term that originated from political science and more specifically from the study of European Union and how it functioned. But then it became a term that's widely used to study public policies that actually, the implementation of which involves a range of actors operating at different scales. Also, it's worth to stress that multi-level governance typically has these two dimensions. One is vertical, and this refers to what I just said about the coordination across the levels of government. And applied to climate change, what that means is that in order to, for example, implement national climate change policies or strategies, the national government need to coordinate, need to cooperate with regional and local governments as agents of change. While at the same time, if you look at what cities are doing to tackle climate change, their actions are also nested in the legal and institutional frameworks operating at higher scales. But there's also the horizontal dimension, which I hinted at already before when stressing the difficulties in managing climate change policies in cities. And this concerns both the international networks in which the cities are increasingly engaged to exchange knowledge and practices on climate change, like the C40 cities, for example, which includes a large number of cities across the world. But also interjurisdictional cooperation. So climate change impacts, they don't stop obviously at the boundary of the city. So there's a strong rationale for coordination within the metropolitan scale to pool resources, exchange knowledge, and also address, well, the cross-boundary impacts and issues. But also, multi-level governance is not unproblematic. There's a whole literature actually criticizing it for criticizing this multi-level setting and way of dealing with public policies as prone to failures, so-called multi-level governance gaps, as the OECD calls it, accountability issues, discrepancies in terms of capacity across the different levels of government. So typically, it tends to be a challenge. And finally, I also use as a heuristic device for this research the distinction between institutions, ideas, and interests that borrowed from political economy to talk and sort of frame the kind of governance challenges that are being encountered in the cities I looked at in managing climate change adaptation policies. Right, so here are my research questions. There's 3 of them, but I will focus on the third one in this presentation for the sake of timekeeping. But basically, I will take you briefly through all of them to give you a better sense of the whole project. So my first research question is, how do delta cities and their regions actually tackle climate change adaptation in different administrative settings? Or in other words, to what extent and how the wider institutional characteristics of states affect urban responses to climate change? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is sort of looking the other way around and is asking about the extent to which climate change adaptation policies in cities actually influence the patterns of governance in delta cities and urban regions. So to what extent collaboration on those issues across sectoral boundaries or across jurisdictional boundaries, cross-level, how does it alter the interactions between the different actors? And finally, what are the governance challenges encountered in this? What are the bottlenecks that constrain urban climate change adaptation policies? And as I said, I will focus on this third question in this presentation. Right, so how I try to respond to these questions is by an explorative and comparative study of climate change policies in 2 polycentric urban regions, one in the Netherlands and one in China. For the Dutch case, that's the Randstad area, which, well, is the kind of horseshoe between Rotterdam, The Hague, Leiden, Amsterdam, and Utrecht. But I focus on the south wing of this region, so mainly Rotterdam and The Hague. And the second one is the Pearl River Delta region in southern China. And within that, I focus on 2 actually groups in a way. Well, on Hong Kong, which has a very special status. It's a special administrative region with a lot of autonomy. And also I look at the mainland Pearl River Delta cities, namely Guangzhou and Shenzhen. And also, gradually I reduced the scope of this research as I started to focus almost exclusively on the question of flood risk that is increasing as a result of climate change for the sake of manageability of the research on the one hand, but also on the other hand, because that's the most salient issue for both regions. That's the issue that is most readily recognized as a threat and something that needs tackling, and that's also where you find actual policies that are the most developed in the two cases. In terms of research methods I used, I use a mixed research methods approach. So I rely mostly on semi-structured interviews with the key informants. And that's my main source of data. I complement that with analysis of secondary sources, policy documents, strategies, and so on, but also social network analysis as a means to map the governance networks and try to triangulate also the insights from the interviews in terms of, centrality of different actors in the networks and so on. Right, so here's, are the maps of the two regions I cover. So you got the Randstad, Rotterdam, and The Hague in the Dutch case, and the PRD, Peru Delta, here. That's the Guangdong province, and you've got Hong Kong here with a sort of violet circle, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. Right, so both areas are polycentric urban regions with multiple of urban centers. Also, what they share as a common characteristic is the relatively rapid urbanization, obviously at a different scale between the two. So this is the Randstad into 1900s and 2000s. You can see the growth of the urban fabric over this period. This is satellite images for the PRD between 1973 and 2003. You can see, a massive difference here in the pace and the scale of change, of course. But that's probably one of the most rapidly urbanizing regions in the world. So what also those regions have in common is that they are, economic powerhouses of the countries within which they are located. So Rotterdam, for example, is one of the main economic hubs and one of the main transport and trade hubs with its port, which is the biggest in Europe. But the other cities I looked at also have this very important role for the regional and global economy, actually. Hong Kong being the financial center, Guangzhou being one of the sort of manufacturing centers, and Shenzhen as well. It's sort of one of the most striking examples of cities with extremely rapid growth based on sort of manufacturing inflow of migrant workers, and now it's become one of the biggest cities in China and economically the most dynamic ones. But at the same time, what those cities also share was, as I said in the beginning, vulnerability to climate change impacts. So, for example, in Rotterdam, flooding in certain areas of the city next to the river that are not protected by dikes is quite a regular phenomenon and is set to increase and become more of a challenge in the future because of the increasing precipitation, higher river discharges, and possibly rising sea level, which will increase the risk of storm surge. So there's a photo from Dordrecht, a city near Rotterdam, with its old town actually being directly exposed to the river and unprotected by dikes. And again, the city regularly gets flooding events, which are increasingly challenging. Another photo from Rotterdam. And some pictures from the PRD cities as well, where waterlogging as a result of extreme weather is increasingly frequent. And also storm surge events are happening too. So this is a picture from Shenzhen, last year's storm surge event. These two are from Tai O. It's a village in Hong Kong, which is directly on the waterfront. It's a fisherman village. And again, a number of occasions in the last decade, it got flooded as a result of the storm surge. And that's the city center of Guangzhou, which regularly gets waterlogging problems because of the rapid urbanization and insufficient capacity of drainage to cope with the increasing precipitation. Right, and also those cities I looked at, and that was my point of departure for the research. In the OECD work on exposure of coastal cities to climate change risks, they figure among the most exposed ones. This is the top 20 cities ranked in terms of population exposed to coastal flooding in 2070. So when you look at the population exposed, Guangzhou comes fourth in the world. And because its population is set to grow dramatically, it's all the more relevant. When you look at the exposure of economic assets, again, you find Guangzhou on very close to the top, on the second position. But also you find the two Dutch cities here, Amsterdam and Rotterdam. That's another, a diagram from another study by insurance company Swiss Re from last year, looking at cities at risk and trying to assess the exposure to natural disasters of different cities. And you can also see the Randstad cities ranking very high, and in blue are the kind of water-related risks which are associated with climate change impacts. And also the PRD is noted as one of the most exposed urban regions in the world. Right, so to sum up, the similarities. Both are polycentric and low-lying delta regions. Both have high and growing density of urban settlements and high concentration of economic activity. Both are extremely vulnerable to climate change impacts, considering the topography. And also both, which I have not mentioned yet, have highly complex governance structures that are also shifting in both cases, which makes those case studies interesting in my opinion. But also there are obviously multiple differences that also justify this research. So I will just go very quickly through this table, not to spend too much time on it, and to leave some more time for discussion of the empirics. But basically in the Randstad we have unitary decentralized state, liberal democracy. In the mainland PRD we have also a system with multiple levels of government, but more authoritarian, more hierarchical, with a single party rule. And in the case of Hong Kong, it's a semi-autonomous city, quite a kind of insular government, operating in a one country, two systems setting with post-colonial legacies. In the Dutch case, we have what is called the polder model. This is consensus-based policymaking that emphasizes seeking of consensus, but also results in slow decision-making. Hardly any participatory policymaking traditions in China, and some in Hong Kong. High degree of autonomy of subnational authorities in the Dutch context, and a strong hierarchy in China, in theory at least. I'll get back to this later. And this insularity of the government in Hong Kong. There's a well-developed culture of bottom-up collaboration and intermunicipal cooperation in Holland, but a rather top-down steering culture in China with underdeveloped horizontal collaboration, and the same applies to Hong Kong. Also, the Randstad operates within the European Union, so the EU policies may also matter for domestic water policies and climate change policies. And this supranational layer is much less relevant in the case of China, even though, for example, in Hong Kong, there's some involvement in international networks of cities. And finally, the big difference is that of scale and the pace of change of urban development, which I have already explained. Okay, so let's look into the more details and into the case of the Randstad. So I have basically closed now the fieldwork stage. I conducted the research in the Randstad in early 2014, and I have just returned from fieldwork in China. So just briefly on the topography. So this map shows you, the elevation relative to sea level rise. And basically the more blue means that it's areas in depression which are particularly vulnerable to rising sea level. I don't think have to stress that a lot. But basically what this means for the Dutch case is that in case of an event where the dike breaks, protecting the country from the sea, there will be a very dramatic event with water spreading extremely fast. There has been simulations done recently, for example, and there's a number of casualties per hour should this happen. So this is obviously something that the Dutch authorities are taking very seriously, especially since there was such an event last time in 1953, which resulted in a number of deaths in New Zealand. And since then, the country has invested a lot in the coastal infrastructure and flood protection infrastructure, for which it's famous. But it's worth to flag this up in the beginning. Right, so what kind of climate change programs and strategies there are? First, one should mention the national level. And there is quite a lot of activity there. Namely, there's the so-called Delta program, which is mainly a water management program that is implemented in coordination across the levels of government with different ministries and provinces and the cities, that aims to update the flood protection measures to actually prepare for the changing climate and the impacts of rising sea level, increasing precipitation, and so on. And it's quite well funded as well. There's a special fund that was set up with roughly €1 billion per year for implementation of projects. In parallel, there's also a program called Knowledge for Climate, which supports research on climate change impacts and measures to tackle it. That also concerns, well, large territory within the country and involves a number of research institutions and levels of government in this process of research. And there's also another program that is worth mentioning as well, is the so-called Room for the River program, which again is a water management program which aims at creating more space for the rivers to accommodate increasing river discharges, to allow the water from the rivers to spill over occasionally without causing major damage to cities. Right, at the regional and local level, probably the most known policy in Holland is actually the Rotterdam Climate Proof Program. That is one of these flagship initiatives of Rotterdam city. And it combines both adaptation and mitigation to climate change with measures to support urban development and enhance the spatial quality in the city, promote sort of economic development on the basis, and so on. But there are also strategies on the regional level, namely in the region of Rotterdam. There's now also an adaptation strategy which brings together some of the municipalities within the region. Not all of them participate in it. And currently they are investigating measures that could serve the implementation of the strategy. And also in the Hague region, in Hague, London, there's also a strategy that brings together all of the municipalities within that region and is coordinated by the authorities of the city region. Right, some measures that are being in place. This is an example of a kind of traditional Dutch approach to tackling flood risk. So massive, highly advanced civil engineering project. This is the Maasland storm surge barrier that protects Rotterdam's harbor. But also increasingly we see a shift towards those softer solutions that shift away from traditional civil engineering and focus more on actually the urban core and that have multiple functions that combine water storage, for example, with creation of space for recreation, greenery, and so on. So this is an example of a so-called water plaza in Rotterdam. You can see here there's a basketball court and some sort of park that in case of heavy rain, it gets flooded with water and stores water temporarily, and then the water is gradually pumped out to the river. This is another water plaza that's also in place in Rotterdam. So that's part of a sort of residential area with a kind of a park, and it's integrated into a park. This is another example, an experimental project looking into the possibilities testing the possibilities of developing floating buildings. There's a kind of exhibition pavilion that was set up as part of the Rotterdam Climate Proof program. So it's the first of the kind, but as far as I know, there are also plans to develop residential districts on that principle. This is an example of a multifunctional flat barrier, sort of a dike with a park on top of it, which again combines different functions for recreation, and green roofs on the buildings that help with water storage. And another example of a multifunctional dike in The Hague, a coastal one this time. This is an example of a project that's also quite experimental, and that's involves actually working with nature to prevent coastal flooding, and it entailed dumping a huge amount of sand perpendicularly to the beach, forming a sort of artificial peninsula, and letting the waves and the currents distribute it evenly across the beach to extend the beach and the dunes gradually, which will help with protecting the city behind the dunes. Right, so a lot of, new ideas that are being experimented with in the Dutch case. So what are the actors that are involved? So just quickly run through the table. At the state level, going from the local to the national level, municipalities are the key actors. Particularly Rotterdam has been one of the leading actors. Port authorities also play an important role, and city regions as coordinators of municipal strategies, as is the case in particular in the Hague region. But there's also a number of deliberative and cooperative bodies in which representatives of the cities can meet together with actors from different levels of government, such as the committees set up as part of the Delta program. Dutch characteristics, there's also so-called water boards, which are a separate level of government that has a special function, and that is keeping the land dry and managing waters. There are safety regions as well that cope with disaster management, provinces that do with spatial planning coordination. Rijkswaterstaat is the special ministry for water management, and the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment, which plays also an important role in the Delta program. On the non-state level, there aren't so many actors involved, actually. There's chiefly maritime business that can take part in those projects and also test new ideas and showcase their expertise. Energy companies, to some extent, are also involved. Some environmental NGOs, but they're quite marginal. And housing associations, mainly for dealing with green roofs or working on adaptive buildings. Knowledge sector obviously plays a big role in the Dutch context. Knowledge for Climate program is a particular forum for that. So there's a number of research institutions, universities that do play active role in this. The EU as well, on sort of level beyond the Netherlands, and Belgian-Flanders region to some extent also is involved in the discussions, at least, on tackling climate change within the wider Delta. Right, so let me just go through the 3 I's and to summarize some of the challenges that are faced in the Dutch case. So first, looking at institutions. So we see that the municipalities that are the most resourceful are playing a key role, like Rotterdam is the main example. Also the city region of The Hague, there where municipalities are perhaps less active, plays a great role. But at the same time, small municipalities, they are not really involved in climate change adaptation policies. They stay aside from this topic. And this is happening with austerity measures in the background, and also the idea of a shrinking state, withdrawal of the state from a number of policies. So it is impossible for many of the local authorities to actually deal with that because they lack capacity, they lack funding, and so on. Also, the Dutch polder model, which can be a great asset when dealing with such a complex issue that requires coordination across the different sectors, speaking to different kinds of experts. But at the same time, it proves to be burdensome It hampers effective decision making, as was reported by many of the interviewees. So one could argue, and this is an argument that I will have to explore a bit more, that perhaps with this model we are following the joint decision trap, where there's too many actors involved to actually take effective decisions. And there's general complexity of administrative arrangements in the Dutch context that render collaboration quite laborious. And related to that, there's a mismatch between the boundaries of the different jurisdictions that are involved, provinces, the water boards, the safety regions, the regions for the purpose of adaptation policy in the Delta program. So I'll show you a map, which is very difficult to read, but this actually reflects to some extent this complexity. So we have the province with this sort of red line. Then there's the two urban regions of Rotterdam and The Hague, with like blue lines, fake blue lines. These are the water boards. So for example, Rotterdam has to deal with 3 water boards. So that's a certain coordination challenge as such. There's also the region of Drechtsteden here around Dordrecht, which is slightly less formalized perhaps. And there's also the metropolitan region, The Hague, Rotterdam, which is now coming into being because of the merger of the two urban regions. So it is a shifting institutional landscape and a very complex one at the same time. Right, so the policy is thus in flux because the system is in flux. There's a lot of uncertainty about how the new urban region, bringing together The Hague and Rotterdam regions, will operate, what competencies it will have. So, yeah, some of the actions are kind of being postponed and not specified further because of this uncertainty. Another issue that boils down to the institutional characteristics of the Netherlands is the fragmented responsibility for flood risk, with coastal flooding being a national responsibility, but the river flooding being that of the water boards, and waterlogging problems stemming from rainfall in the cities are the task of the municipality. So there's 3 different layers that deal with 3 different kinds of flooding. The trouble is that with climate change, all of them come together because all of them become increasingly a problem. Then also a particular responsibility or accountability problem is the lack of clear allocation of responsibility for the so-called unembanked areas. So these are parts of the city, which I showed you the image of Dordrecht, for example, or the flooding in Rotterdam in the beginning. The areas that are actually located by the river but are not protected by dikes. So that's, for example, a satellite image of Rotterdam with this Kop van Zout district, which is unprotected by a dike, and therefore is particularly vulnerable to climate change related flooding. That's a map showing you, well, instead of brown-red color, the unembanked areas in Rotterdam, with this Kop van Zout area here, and the whole port area basically being in this situation. So with a lot of economic assets also located there, and particularly vulnerable to either storm surges or increasing river discharges. Right, in terms of ideas, so what's quite interesting in the Dutch case is that there is this historically rooted centrality of the water management. It has been key for the state building in the Netherlands. It's key to the very existence of the state, of the country, because nearly half of this territory has been reclaimed from the sea and requires very attentive and careful water management to keep it dry. So this means there's a very strong focus on water in climate adaptation policies, and therefore there's much less emphasis on other issues, such as, for example, urban heat islands, which are also affecting Dutch cities. And well, that also means that water boards play a very important role in this setting. Right, so, and also what's interesting in terms of ideas is the paradox that we see, that there is too much trust in the long-established flood protection system, which breeds some sort of complacency and undermines public support for adaptation policies. The public being convinced that the water authorities are doing a great job, so there's no point in spending more money on a distant threat, and so on. And also, what's important here is that those new soft measures to tackle flood risk that I showed you in the beginning could play an important role in raising awareness of the people and overcoming this problem. Right. Also, another aspect is that there is quite a difficult collaboration between the water boards and the cities. They have to collaborate as part of the Delta program, namely, but also within the urban programs such as the Rotterdam Climate Proof. They have to collaborate on tackling climate change. But this collaboration is quite difficult because of the different ways of doing things, different approaches that the civil engineers, the water boards have, and the planners in the cities have, different priorities. Right, and finally, in terms of interests, what's quite striking is the difficulty in engaging business in these policies, with some successes in getting the marine industry involved, which sees it as an opportunity to showcase its capacity to the world. And it's part of also of Rotterdam's city branding strategy. The city sort of presents itself as a resilient water city and tries to project this image globally. There's also a question of who pays for the new infrastructure. Should this be the city? Should this be the central government, the water boards? Of course, no one wants to take this responsibility in terms of austerity. There's also the question of who takes responsibility for climate change impacts themselves. For example, what happens if a major flooding event happens in the unembanked areas? It's, as I said, it's a kind of legal gray zone for responsibilities, and no one wants to take that hot potato. Right, and finally, there's also obviously electoral cycle considerations, because adaptation requires substantial investment for mitigating a risk that is quite distant to most of the people. They don't see it coming anytime soon. Therefore, there's a strong temptation to cater to other societal interests first. And finally, I'll close with this comment on sort of place branding as a strategy to promote the city, and that's namely the case for Rotterdam. The question that one may ask, how effective actually are the measures that are being put in place? We don't have yet knowledge on this. And what is behind the positively loaded discourse on resilient city, on water city in Rotterdam? Right, I have to accelerate on the PRD case. So basically just a few words about the topography. What's similar is the low elevation as well in the delta, but also there's a large urban areas that are directly on the coast, like in Shenzhen here, and also, in Shenzhen here, and in Hong Kong, that are directly exposed to storm surges. And that's, for example, in Hong Kong, there's also a large number of reclaimed areas. So large parts of this central business district in Hong Kong are on reclaimed land, and there's a number of ongoing reclamation projects and planned reclamation projects for the future, for the airport, for example, that's located here, and so on. So this will mean more and more exposure to the rising sea level impacts. Right, so what is there in Hong Kong for the moment in terms of climate change policy? Well, there isn't much to begin with. There is a study by the Hong Kong Observatory, which is the kind of meteorological office of Hong Kong, that did excellent research on the sea level rise and storm surge risks. However, it has not really been taken up by the government in terms of, for example, standards for designing coastal infrastructure or the flood infrastructure. There's also a study on climate change in Hong Kong that was done by the Environmental Protection Department in 2010, but it covers mostly mitigation. Adaptation is hardly present in there. However, there is an ongoing recognition of climate change impacts, and there are now ongoing efforts in different departments of the Hong Kong government to do something about those impacts. but without any overarching strategy nor coordination across departments. So we see a lot of isolated examples of adaptation measures, which, however, remain quite accidental and typically are not even framed or labeled as climate adaptation. So just a few examples. Actually, you will see that these are similar ideas to those that I showed you from the Dutch case, like underground storage tanks under a park here in Sheung area in Hong Kong. So you combine some different functions as well. That's another example, a storage tank that is now in construction under the racetrack in Happy Valley. In terms of actors, it's a much simpler picture than in the Dutch case. You basically have the different departments of Hong Kong government that are involved. There's some involvement of non-state actors, namely the environmental NGOs and business association, and some of the major businesses in transportation, like the metro company and electrical supply companies, and to some extent universities and research institutions. And there's some degree of collaboration with the mainland China, but it's mainly about window dressing. There's not much happening in practice. And Hong Kong is also part of the C40 cities network. That's a global organization, but focus there is mainly on mitigation of climate change. Right, so in terms of institutions, it's a small and insular government that does not have to deal with lower or higher scales of government. It's kind of self-sufficient to a large extent. There's a wealth of engineering and scientific expertise and availability of data on impacts of climate change, but these are not really being used. And that's partly or mainly because of the deeply embedded divisions between the different sectoral departments of the government that are not at all used to work together. And that's, well, what also repeatedly given as explanation of the situation is this post-colonial administration legacy. Planning department is not at all involved in the discussions on climate change that I mentioned in the beginning. And finally, similarly as in the Netherlands, there's a certain accountability problem for flood risk, with drainage services department being responsible for flood risk and dealing with it, but coastal flooding not being part of its responsibilities, even though coastal flooding is possibly the biggest challenge ahead. In terms of ideas, there's low but growing awareness of climate change impacts. However, short-term thinking is the norm. And interestingly, also, there's perception of typhoons and extreme weather as something quite normal in this region. Hence, the focus is on drainage of the excess water and early warning, rather than actually on preventing the events from happening. NGOs are quite influential in setting the tone of the debate on climate change, involving conferences and consultations and so on. And quite importantly also, one of the leaders in the Environment Bureau comes from an NGO background, and she has been quite instrumental in driving the whole shift in policy in Hong Kong and stimulating the thinking about climate change adaptation. Right, no real cross-border cooperation on this issue. Part of this explanation to that is also the resentment towards the mainlanders, which has been increasing recently, as you may have read on the news recently. And maybe to a similar extent, to some extent similarly in the Netherlands, there's a certain degree of complacency and trust in the drainage system that have been greatly improved over the last 20 years, but has not been designed with climate change impacts in mind. It doesn't consider the data on the rising sea level and extreme weather. And finally, the Occupy Central movement and the protest movement and the constitutional crisis that we've seen unfolding in the last year actually undermines the legitimacy of the government, which means that it is much less inclined to deal with climate change. It's by no means a priority for the government. It's more focused on running a daily business. Right, and finally, in terms of interest, it's a very business-orientated government, so it would be quite reluctant to impose any measures that would be costly for the business. But at the same time, some of the particularly vulnerable businesses, like the metro company or the China Light and Power company, lead the way in climate change adaptation measures, are way ahead of the government in terms of thinking about climate adaptation. Right, very quickly about the mainland PRD. Let me just give you one bottom line phrase about the mainland PRD. Basically, what's striking there, there's no climate change adaptation at all. And that's quite striking because you've seen the data on the exposure of Guangzhou, for example, but there is no actions whatsoever. And so in case of Guangzhou and Shenzhen, my research questions had to be turned around a little bit. And I had to try to answer why there's no adaptation actions being taken. Right. So what we can conclude first is that urbanization patterns and climate change vulnerability are closely connected. So my findings, I think, confirm this assumption. But this is not readily recognized by decision makers. In some cases, it is downright ignored, and what is preferred is rapid urban expansion to stimulate economic growth, to make profits out of the real estate, and no consideration is really given to longer-term thinking about climate change impacts in some cases, namely in the case of the mainland PRD. The administrative system and the national institutional characteristics are quite fundamental factors, actually, for determine how cities tackle climate change. I hope I conveyed that to some extent, that those characteristics were quite crucial in shaping the responses in those different cities. Acknowledging their interdependencies across the different scales is also essential for explaining why climate change risks are addressed or not by those cities, and how. And finally, cross-level, interjurisdictional, and cross-sectoral governance challenges and accountability gaps constraining climate change adaptation can be identified in both of the regions I looked at, albeit to a different extent, and we've seen that they have quite different magnitude. And also, interestingly, a closer look at the projects, for example, that are being implemented in those different cities, is that essentially similar flood protection measures are being taken, mixing water management with urban development projects. However, their aims and framing vary greatly. In the case of China, they are not labeled as climate adaptation policy. Why they are labeled as such in the Dutch case and showcased as an example of forward thinking. So what are the implications for practice? I guess that the main one is that climate change risk awareness building is really fundamental in order to build support for investment in climate adaptation. And that concerns both regions studied here. Right. Also, the framing of climate change adaptation measures as an opportunity to improve spatial quality and attractiveness of the city could stimulate the development of adaptation measures and enhance the adaptive capacity of the city. The question is then, who benefits from those measures? And this would be a bit clearer if I showed you a bit more the case of Shenzhen, where really impressive new developments are taking place with massive urban extensions, adopting a lot of ideas that we saw in the case of Rotterdam with waterways and multifunctional flood protections integrated into the urban fabric, but for different reasons. The reasons are to increase the value of the real estate and make the city more attractive for investors. So who benefits? And finally, improving vertical and horizontal coordination is the essential ingredient for making delta cities climate change proof. Some emerging reflections that are in progress is, as I said, what's behind the discourse, the positively loaded discourse on resilience and adaptive capacity in the cities. What is the actual effectiveness of those measures in coping with climate change? And the second one, importing multifunctional solutions, like from the cases of Rotterdam, to Shenzhen or Guangzhou, which we see happening. What's quite puzzling here is that those practices are being imported, but without consideration of their original objectives, which was to cope with climate change impacts and make the cities more resilient to flooding. Here, the objective is rather to maximize profits and make the cities more attractive. So it's an interesting case of policy transfer in which imported solutions serve a completely different purpose than was originally planned. Should I stop here?
If you would don't mind.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll leave you with this. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Sorry for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.